I always imagined my daughter's wedding would be a day of joy, of shared tears and laughter, of a bond made stronger in public celebration. But as I stood outside the grand hall, clutching the small silver clutch I had bought just for the occasion, a cold knot settled in my chest. I hadn't been invited to the rehearsal dinner, but I told myself maybe that was just an oversight. I hadn't been asked to help plan the ceremony, but I told myself maybe she was just busy. I hadn't even seen the invitation. I found out about the wedding through a neighbor who had received one. Still, I showed up, dressed in pale lilac satin and soft pearls, trying to hold on to hope. I raised Emily on my own after her father left us when she was 7. I sacrificed, scrimped, and survived so she could have piano lessons, new shoes, and a real chance at college. I thought that kind of love couldn't be forgotten. But now, standing there in the autumn chill, I wasn't sure if she remembered anything at all. If you have a similar story about betrayal from the people you least expect, tell us in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Inside, the reception sparkled with gold-rimmed glasses and silk-draped tables. I spotted Emily immediately, her silhouette glowing under the crystal chandeliers, laughing beside her groom, Nathan. She looked radiant, taller than I remembered, more poised than I'd imagined, like a stranger who had borrowed my daughter's face. I didn't want to interrupt her, so I made my way to the seating chart, scanning for my name with shaking hands. Row after row passed, and finally, I saw it. Miss Helen Porter, table 12. I smiled until I saw table 12 was tucked away in the corner, beside the coat rack, behind a pillar. I walked to it anyway, head held high, refusing to let my disappointment bend my back. At the table were 3 other guests I didn't know, their polite smiles reminding me I didn't belong. I wanted to believe there'd be a moment, some point during the night, where she'd call me over, hug me, whisper, "Thank you, Mom." But hope was starting to feel like a fool's costume I couldn't take off. Dinner came and went, with laughter and speeches at the main table echoing through the room like music I wasn't invited to dance to. I watched as Emily toasted her best friend, her new in-laws, her college mentor, and even Nathan's dog walker. When she finally stood up for her formal speech, my heart lifted just slightly, expecting some sliver of acknowledgement. Her voice rang clear, rehearsed and confident, thanking everyone who has made me the woman I am today. I waited for my name, a glance, a nod, anything. Instead, she said sometimes, family doesn't come from blood. Sometimes, they come from choice. The guests clapped, completely unaware that I was sitting only a few feet away, unraveling at the seams. My fork trembled in my hand and the chicken on my plate grew cold, untouched. Still, I stayed seated, hoping there would be a second toast. There wasn't. Eventually, I decided to try approaching her, not during a speech, not during a dance, but in a quiet lull when guests were mingling. I walked toward her slowly, rehearsing what I'd say. She saw me before I reached her and stiffened, her eyes darting toward Nathan, then her bridesmaids. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice soft, hoping for warmth. "I just wanted to say congratulations. You look stunning." Her expression didn't soften. Instead, she stepped slightly back as if my presence embarrassed her. "Mom," she said, almost under her breath, "I think it's better if you don't cause a scene." I blinked, stunned. "A scene?" I echoed, but she was already turning back to her friends. My words, my presence, everything about me had been erased from her world. I retreated to the shadows of the hall, finding refuge near the exit where the cold seeped in through the cracks. I sat on a wooden bench, smoothing my skirt over my knees, wondering what I had done to deserve this kind of forgetting. I wasn't perfect, no mother is, but I had been there for every scraped knee, every spelling bee, every heartbreak. I remembered a birthday when I worked a 14-hour shift, just so I could afford the exact glittering shoes she wanted. I remembered sitting up late with her, stroking her back as she cried over college rejection letters. I remembered the way she used to hold my hand without thinking, like it was the most natural place for hers to be. And now, I was little more than a ghost, at the edge of her celebration. Still, I didn't cry. I sat there, spine straight, waiting for the night to end. I thought if I waited long enough, she'd come find me. But instead, someone else did. It was Nathan, the groom, walking alone, a drink in hand, brow furrowed like he was searching for something. He paused when he saw me, tilting his head in surprise. "Miss Porter?" he asked gently, stepping closer. "What are you doing over here?" His voice was kind, uncertain. I smiled tightly. "Just letting the young people have their fun." He frowned, looking genuinely confused. "But you're her mother." I nodded. "Yes, I am." And I waited to see what he would do with that truth. He sat down beside me without a word for a long moment, elbows on knees, eyes scanning the room as if seeing it for the first time. "Emily told me you were in Europe," he said finally, "that you weren't coming." I felt like I'd been struck. "Europe?" I repeated. "I haven't left this city in years." He looked down, processing that information, his face clouding with something I couldn't quite name. "She said you didn't support the wedding, that you disapproved of me." I laughed bitterly. Just once, soft and small. "I've never met you before today." He turned to look at me then, really look at me, and I saw the confusion giving way to something colder. "She said you were cold, controlling, that you cut her off after college." His voice was cautious now, as if realizing the picture he'd been given might not be complete. I shook my head slowly, keeping my voice steady. "I worked 2 jobs for her tuition. I sold my car so she could afford her apartment when internships didn't pay. And I never stopped calling, even when she stopped answering." Nathan looked away, jaw tightening. "I don't know what to believe." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. "You'll have to decide that for yourself." He stood up then, slowly. "Thank you for being here tonight." I'm sorry." After Nathan walked away, I stayed on the bench a little longer, the chill in the air crawling under my skin. The weight of everything that had just been said sat heavy on my chest, anchoring me to the seat. So my daughter had told him I was in Europe, that I disapproved of her marriage, that I was controlling. It felt like hearing my own eulogy from someone who had never met me. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and stared out through the glass doors, watching the lights from inside flicker like stars I could never reach. A part of me wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, to drag Emily out and make her look at me, really look. But another part of me, the part that had been broken and stitched together too many times, just wanted to go home. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the small envelope I had brought for her. Inside was a card with a handwritten letter and a check I had saved up from months of baking and selling pies at the local farmer's market. I had imagined giving it to her personally, a final gesture of love and support. Now it felt like a goodbye gift. I stood up slowly, knees creaking with the familiar ache that came from years of cleaning houses and standing behind counters. As I made my way toward the gift table, I walked along the edge of the celebration like a shadow. No one looked at me, no one paused their dancing or laughter to wonder who the older woman in the lilac dress might be. I reached the table, carefully slid the envelope between 2 wrapped boxes, and took a breath so deep it hurt. That was it. That was all I had left to give. As I turned to leave, I heard the sharp tap of a microphone being tested at the front of the room. I looked back, expecting to see another toast, another speech from someone who knew nothing of what had been left behind. But it wasn't just anyone. It was Nathan. He stood there, tall and pale, the microphone trembling slightly in his hand. At first, his voice didn't come, just a long pause as he looked around the room, his eyes searching. Then finally, he spoke, and the room slowly hushed. "Before we continue this celebration," he said, "there's something I need to say." His voice was clear, but strained, each word deliberate. "I want to thank everyone who came here to support us, and I especially want to thank those who helped us get here." People nodded. Some clapped, thinking this was just another round of polite acknowledgments. But Nathan held up a hand, silencing them. "There's someone here tonight who wasn't supposed to be, someone I was told wouldn't show up, who I was told didn't care." I froze near the exit, unable to move. But that was a lie. The guests began murmuring, confused, eyes darting from table to table. Emily stood beside the cake, her face already flushed from champagne, but her smile faltered as Nathan continued. "Her name is Helen Porter," he said, and I heard the audible intake of breath ripple through the room. She is the mother of the bride." All heads turned. I could feel the heat of their stares pressing against my back like spotlights. I didn't move. I couldn't. "I only met her tonight, briefly," Nathan said. "But in that short moment, I learned more truth than I've heard in 3 years." Emily stepped forward now, panic flashing in her eyes. "Nathan, what are you doing?" she called, but he ignored her. "Helen, if you're still here, please come forward." I didn't know what to do. My legs moved before my brain could stop them, carrying me slowly, almost unwillingly, toward the front. I walked past the tables, past the sea of wide eyes and confused whispers, until I was standing just a few feet from Nathan. He held the microphone down and leaned toward me. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, and I nodded. He turned back to the crowd and raised the mic. "Emily told me her mother abandoned her, that she wasn't supportive of this marriage, that she had cut all ties." Emily's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no words came out. "But Helen is none of those things. She's been here the whole time." And she raised Emily alone. She gave up everything for her. The silence in the room was suffocating. Emily's bridesmaids shifted uncomfortably. Guests glanced between each other, unsure of what to do. "This woman," Nathan said, "worked 2 jobs so Emily could go to college. She gave until she had nothing left, and then she gave more." He paused, voice thick with emotion now. "I was lied to, and I think everyone in this room deserves to know that." Emily stepped forward, reaching for the microphone. "Nathan, stop, please." But he turned slightly, stepping away from her grasp. "No," he said firmly, "I won't marry someone who's ashamed of their own mother." Gasps followed his words, loud and sharp, like glass breaking. Emily looked like she'd been struck. Her hands shook at her sides, and her perfectly curled hair began to fall loose around her face. "You don't understand," she said, voice rising. "She always made me feel small. She made me feel like I had to be perfect, or I'd disappoint her." I stepped back, stunned by her words, hearing them land like darts on my chest. "I loved you," I said, my voice cracking. "I never asked for perfect. I only asked for kindness." Nathan looked between us, jaw clenched. "Whatever happened between you two, it's clear something is broken here," he said. "But I won't be part of a family built on lies and shame." The DJ had long since turned off the music. Waitstaff had frozen in place. Every guest was watching the collapse of a wedding in real time, some horrified, others enthralled. Emily turned to the crowd, her makeup streaking as tears began to fall. "Please," she said, "don't listen to her. She's always had a way of making herself look like the victim." I wanted to scream, to defend myself, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Not to her. Nathan looked at me, then back at the guests, and finally at Emily. "I can't do this," he said. "I'm sorry." And with that, he walked off the stage and into the night. For a long moment, no one moved. The air hung heavy with disbelief, every breath in the room drawn and held like a collective gasp. Emily stood rooted to the floor, her hand extended toward the space where Nathan had been, as if trying to pull him back with sheer will. But he was gone, the grand door still swinging slightly from the force of his exit. Somewhere, a glass clinked against a plate, accidental and awkward, the only sound to break the tension. I stayed where I was, unsure whether to retreat or confront the mess unraveling before me. My heart beat so loudly I could hear it echo in my ears. Guests began whispering, their words sharp and soft all at once, a hum of judgment growing louder with each passing second. I turned and saw a few sympathetic glances, but most were merely curious, drawn to the wreckage like spectators at a crash site. I hadn't come here to cause destruction. I had come only to love. But somehow, by standing still and telling the truth, I had cracked the foundation of a lie built too tall to stand. Emily finally spoke, her voice brittle, like thin glass under pressure. "You always find a way to ruin everything," she said, her eyes locked on mine, not caring that 100 faces watched her. "You never could just stay quiet and let me be happy." I took a breath, slow and steady, refusing to let her words burrow under my skin. "Emily?" I replied gently. "I said nothing tonight." He asked. I answered. She shook her head like a child refusing reality, her earrings swaying wildly with the motion. "You manipulated him." Just like you always manipulated me." The words felt rehearsed, like armor she'd worn so long she didn't know how to take it off. "I didn't come to fight," I said, voice low. "I came because I thought this day meant something to you." Her laugh was sharp and humorless, the sound of someone fraying at the edges. "You only came to make yourself the victim again," she snapped, wiping mascara from beneath her eyes. "That's what you always do, spin your stories, make people feel sorry for you." I clenched my hands at my sides, willing myself to remain calm. I didn't want this to turn into a screaming match. Not in front of strangers, not when everything had already fallen apart. "I didn't tell Nathan anything," I said again, measured and careful. "He asked why I was sitting alone. He asked why I wasn't at the front, and I answered." Her mouth trembled, and for the first time all night, I saw not anger in her eyes, but fear. "You don't know what it's like to feel ashamed of your roots," she whispered, the words barely audible. I took a step forward then, not out of anger, but because I finally understood. "Then maybe it's time you stop running from them." I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned and walked away, my shoes clicking softly against the marble floor, the weight of everything behind me growing heavier with each step. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed air, space, somewhere without chandeliers or stairs. Outside, the night had grown colder, the breeze biting against my skin like needles. I crossed the parking lot slowly, passing rows of sleek black cars and spotless white sedans, all parked for a celebration that had twisted into something else entirely. I reached the sidewalk and kept walking, not looking back. There were no tears, not yet, only numbness, like the ache that comes before a bruise fully forms. I passed a bakery closed for the evening, its window frosted with warm yellow light and a sign that read, "Be sweet to those who serve." I almost laughed at the irony. On the next corner, there was a small bus stop bench, and I sat down, the hard plastic a sudden comfort against my spine. I watched the traffic lights change colors with mechanical indifference, green to yellow to red and back again. My hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline still buzzing in my veins, though I had done nothing but stand still and tell the truth. A few cars passed, their headlights washing over me like waves I didn't have the strength to ride. I thought of Nathan, of his face when I told him my side, of how quickly understanding dawned in his eyes. He had been lied to for so long and still chose to believe me. That meant something. I didn't know where he'd gone or what his future would look like now, but I hoped he'd find peace. As for Emily, I didn't know what she would do either. Part of me hoped she'd reflect on what had happened, but another part of me knew how tightly she clung to her version of the truth. After all, when your whole identity is built on a story, rewriting it feels like erasing yourself. My phone buzzed in my purse, and I pulled it out with a sigh. It was a text from my neighbor, Anna, who had been feeding my cat while I was at the wedding. "Saw something on social media. Are you okay?" I didn't even know people had already posted about it. Probably some guest had filmed Nathan's speech, uploaded it, and let it spread like wildfire. I typed back slowly, "I'm fine. We'll explain later. Thank you for checking in." Then I powered off the phone and placed it back inside. Tonight I didn't need the world's opinions or strangers' sympathy. I just needed a moment to remember who I was before all of this. I leaned back against the bench and closed my eyes. For the first time in a long while, I let the silence hold me without apology. The sound of approaching footsteps made me open my eyes again. A man's silhouette came into view, walking quickly but with hesitation in his gait. As he got closer, I realized it was Nathan. His tie was loose, his jacket gone, and his hair was slightly disheveled from the wind. He looked around until he saw me, and relief washed over his face like sunrise after a long, stormy night. "I figured you might come this way," he said breathlessly. I didn't stand. I just watched him, unsure of what to say. He sat down beside me, hands clasped together, elbows resting on his knees. For a moment, we just sat there, two people stripped of ceremony, of illusion, of everything but the truth. "Thank you," he said finally, "for not walking away from me when you could have." I looked at Nathan, his face illuminated by the dim streetlight above the bench, and for the first time all night, I didn't feel alone. He wasn't just grateful. He looked shaken, like the foundation of everything he believed had cracked open. "You didn't owe me anything," I said softly, not quite ready to accept his gratitude. He turned toward me, brow furrowed with guilt and disbelief. "I did, though," he replied. "I let her paint a picture of you, and I never questioned it." I tilted my head, the breeze lifting a lock of my graying hair. "People see what they want to see when they love someone," I said. "You had no reason to doubt her." He shook his head, lips tight. "Maybe not before, but tonight I saw something in her I can't unsee." The words hung heavy in the air between us, too large and too painful to unpack in one breath. Nathan leaned back against the bench, letting out a slow exhale. "I always wondered why you weren't around," he admitted. "At birthdays, holidays, you were just an excuse, a story that never really added up." I nodded, unsurprised, but still stung by the confirmation. "She told me you abandoned her when she needed you most, that you didn't want to be part of her life anymore." I looked away, blinking hard. "I called her every week for the first year she moved out," I said, voice low. "She blocked my number." Nathan's expression twisted in pain, and for a moment I saw the heartbreak he was hiding behind his calm. "She never told me that," he whispered, shaking his head. "She said you cut her off financially, emotionally, everything." I laughed, not bitterly, but with a kind of worn-out exhaustion. "I sent her rent money for 6 months after graduation. I sent care packages, letters, even flowers on her first work anniversary." His eyes widened, the weight of her lies finally settling into his bones. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" he asked, then winced at his own question. "Sorry, that's not fair. You didn't even know I existed." I nodded slowly. "Exactly. She didn't want you to know I existed." Nathan leaned forward, elbows on his knees again, his hands clasped tightly as if in prayer. "I feel like I just lost someone I thought I knew," he said. "But maybe I never really knew her at all." We sat there in silence, the world spinning on without us, as headlights swept past and distant music from the reception drifted into the night. I didn't know what Nathan would do now, whether he'd return or walk away forever. But for that moment we were two people sitting at the edge of something broken, trying to find solid ground. "Do you think she ever loved me?" he asked after a while. I hesitated, not wanting to answer too quickly. "I think she loved the version of you that didn't ask hard questions." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but it caught in his throat. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "That sounds about right." We both looked ahead, the streetlights stretching long shadows across the pavement. "I was ready to start a life with her," he said. "But now I feel like that life was never really mine to begin with." "I know how that feels," I said, my voice steady, though my heart trembled. "For years, I built my life around Emily, her dreams, her comfort, her future. I forgot to build one for myself." Nathan turned to me, eyes filled with sympathy. "That's what parents do, right?" he asked. "Put their kids first." I smiled faintly. "We're supposed to, but there's a line between love and losing yourself." He nodded, understanding more than he should have to. "Do you regret it?" he asked. I paused, searching for the truth. "No, but I do regret not loving myself enough to see when I was being erased." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wedding ring, holding it in his palm like it was something sacred and broken all at once. "I was going to give this to her tonight," he said. "Not just the ceremony version. I mean truly give it to her, choose her for the rest of my life." I looked at the ring, simple and elegant, a symbol of something that might never be. "And now?" I asked gently. Nathan turned it in his fingers, the metal catching the streetlight like a fading star. "Now, I think I'll keep it as a reminder." I didn't ask of what. He didn't need to say it. "Some people show you who they are only when they think they've won," he added. "And some show you who you are by trying to make you disappear." Those words struck deep, echoing in the chambers of my chest where old wounds hadn't quite healed. For a long time, I had believed that maybe I had failed as a mother, that maybe Emily's silence was my punishment for not being softer, for working too much, for falling short in ways I couldn't name. But now I began to wonder if I had simply become too easy to blame, a convenient scapegoat for someone afraid to face her own reflection. "I'm not perfect," I whispered, "but I never deserved to be hated for loving her." Nathan placed the ring back into his pocket and looked at me with something like reverence. "You didn't," he said simply, and tonight I think everyone finally saw that. The ache in my chest shifted slightly, not gone, but less sharp than before. A cab passed slowly down the street, its headlights washing us in temporary gold. Nathan flagged it down with a raised hand, standing as it pulled to a stop beside the bench. "Where will you go?" I asked. He looked down the street toward the hall and then back at me. "Not there," he said. "I'll get a hotel for tonight, call my brother in the morning. He'll come get me." I stood as well, brushing imaginary dust from my skirt. "Do you need anything?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Just one thing," he said, reaching into his wallet. He handed me a business card, his name and number printed in clean font. "If you ever want to talk about anything, I'd like to stay in touch." If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. I took Nathan's card and held it carefully, as if it were something fragile, something not quite real yet. The name was printed in simple black ink, but it carried a weight I hadn't expected, an open door where I thought only walls remained. "Thank you," I said quietly, unsure what I was thanking him for. The truth, the kindness, the courage to walk away. He gave me a soft smile, one laced with regret and strength all at once. "Maybe this isn't how things were supposed to go," he said, opening the cab door. "But maybe it's how they had to." I nodded slowly, heart aching with a strange mix of grief and clarity. Sometimes broken things reveal what shouldn't have been hidden. He gave a short nod, climbed into the cab, and closed the door behind him. The car pulled away, its red taillights shrinking into the darkness, and just like that, he was gone. I stood alone again, the quiet swallowing me like fog rolling in across a field. Everything around me felt surreal. The flowers, the music still faint in the distance, the glitter of a wedding that would never be. I started walking, unsure where to go, unsure if I should head home or wait for my body to tell me it was time. As I passed the building again, I glanced at the grand ballroom doors still propped open, spilling warm light and the scent of roses onto the stone steps. Inside, guests were leaving, some slipping out quietly, others lingering as though they were unsure if the evening was truly over. I caught sight of Emily near the dance floor, sitting alone at the main table, staring at her untouched wine glass. She looked smaller now, as if something had drained the air out of her. Her dress still shimmered, but it no longer looked regal, it looked heavy. The weight of a crown she didn't earn. I turned away before she could see me. As I made my way toward the back lot where my car was parked, I heard quick footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Mom?" Emily called, her voice frayed and breathless. "Please wait." I stopped but didn't turn, bracing myself for more accusations, more stories twisted to fit a version of me she had spent years resenting. "I didn't know he was going to do that," she said, now standing behind me, the chill between us thicker than the evening air. I turned slowly, seeing her face up close for the first time all night. Her eyes were red, makeup smudged, her mouth trembling. "You humiliated me," she said, her voice barely holding steady. "He humiliated you," I corrected. "I didn't say a word you hadn't already tried to bury." She flinched like I'd slapped her, but I wasn't shouting, wasn't even angry anymore. "You lied to him," I said quietly. "About me, about the past, about everything." Her jaw clenched, but she didn't deny it. "I didn't know how else to explain why we weren't close," she muttered, looking down at her shoes. "You could have told the truth," I replied. "That you chose to disappear." She looked up, eyes swimming with tears. "I didn't want to feel guilty anymore," she whispered. "You made me feel like everything I had came from your suffering." My heart twisted at the confession, not because she was wrong, but because I had never meant for love to become a debt she resented paying. "I didn't give to you so you'd owe me," I said. "I gave to you because I'm your mother." The silence that followed was not the cold, empty kind. It was the tense, shifting kind that comes when the truth is finally exposed to air. "You could have just stayed away," she said suddenly, her voice sharper. "It would have been easier." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she hadn't come to apologize. She had come to reclaim control. "Easier for you," I said. "Not for me." Her eyes narrowed. You just had to make it about you again. I stepped back, stunned but not surprised. Emily, I said softly, this was never about me. It was about a daughter who erased her mother and thought no one would notice. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, hugging herself like a child. He was supposed to be mine, she said, not yours. The words cut deeper than I expected, not because I misunderstood them, but because I understood them too well. I never tried to take him from you, I said gently. He saw the truth on his own. She shook her head violently, curls falling loose from the pins that barely held them. You always do this, she hissed. You come in like a ghost and ruin everything. My voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver either. You ruin this, Emily, I said, not by choosing someone else to love, but by choosing to hate the person who loved you first. Her shoulders sank, and for a split second I thought I saw something real flicker in her eyes. Regret, perhaps. But it was gone as quickly as it came. I don't know how to fix this, she whispered. You can't fix something you won't admit you broke, I said. That's the first step. She looked down at the hem of her dress, now fraying slightly from the edges, dragging against the pavement. Will he come back? She asked, not looking at me. I didn't answer right away. I don't know, I finally said. But if he does, it won't be for the woman you were tonight. Her lip trembled, and she turned her face away. Why did you even come? She asked. I hesitated, then spoke the truth. Because despite everything, I still believed you might want me there. She didn't reply, didn't argue, didn't run. She just stood there in silence as I walked away. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and took one last glance through the windshield. Emily remained on the sidewalk, arms still crossed, staring at the parking lot like it might offer answers. I started the engine and pulled away. Not fast, not slow, just steady. I didn't cry, not this time. I felt hollow, yes, but also lighter somehow. Like I had finally set something down that I'd been carrying far too long. For the first time in years, I didn't leave wondering what more I could have done. I left knowing I had done enough. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, wrapped in the quiet stillness of my apartment. The light filtering through the blinds painted soft gray lines on the carpet, and the clock blinked 5:13 a.m. in pale green. I sat up slowly, every muscle aching not from exertion but from emotional weight I hadn't yet processed. My dress from the night before still hung on the bedroom door, the lilac fabric looking more faded in the soft morning light. I walked to the kitchen, started the kettle, and stood barefoot on the cold tile floor, watching the steam rise in lazy spirals. My phone was on the table, silent, face down, but its presence felt louder than anything in the room. I wasn't sure if I wanted to check it yet. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear Emily's voice again, pleading or blaming or pretending none of it had happened. The tea steeped in silence, chamomile and honey wafting up like a lullaby I hadn't earned. I carried the mug to the couch and sat there, legs tucked under me, trying to remember the last time I had a morning like this. There were no demands today, no expectations, no role to play. I didn't have to fix anything. I didn't have to brace myself for another silence from Emily or another polite lie. I thought of Nathan again. His expression when he held out his card, the way he'd said thank you like it had cost him something. There was a peace in him by the end of the night, even if everything had come apart. I found myself wondering if he'd slept at all, or if he'd watched the ceiling in a hotel room like I had watched the clock. I finally reached for the phone, thumb hovering above the screen before unlocking it. There were 3 missed calls from an unknown number, 1 voicemail, and a single text from Emily. The message was short. I'm sorry you felt unwelcome. I just needed it to be perfect. I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't understand, but because I understood it far too well. She still hadn't said she was sorry for what she did, only sorry for how I felt. There was a vast, aching difference between those two things. I didn't reply. I set the phone back down, this time screen up, and finished my tea in slow, measured sips. Outside, the city began to stir, car engines starting, birds rustling in the hedges beneath my window. A small part of me wondered if Emily was still in that dress, curled up somewhere in her apartment or hotel room, afraid to face the mess she had made. But I stopped myself from indulging that thought for too long. I had spent enough years imagining how she might be feeling, and it had never changed what she did. Today wasn't for her. Today was for me. By mid-morning, I was dressed in jeans and a soft sweater, hair pulled back loosely, the makeup drawer untouched. I went to the bakery on 3rd Street, the one where the cashier always gave me a day-old cinnamon roll for free if I came early enough. She didn't say anything about the wedding. I wasn't sure if she'd seen the video, or if she even knew Emily, and I wasn't about to explain. The kindness in her small smile was enough. I took my pastry and walked to the park, sitting on the same bench I had once pushed Emily on as a little girl. The trees swayed gently above me, shedding the last of their golden leaves like whispered goodbyes. I watched a toddler chase a pigeon in a zigzag path of delight, while his father followed slowly behind, coffee in hand. There was a quiet ache inside me, but not sharp like last night, more like an old bruise finally starting to fade. I closed my eyes and let the morning wrap around me. In the afternoon, I stopped by the community center to drop off a donation bag I'd been meaning to bring for weeks. The receptionist, Marcia, greeted me with her usual warmth, complimenting my scarf and asking if I'd like to volunteer next week for their senior luncheon. I agreed without thinking, surprised at how natural it felt to say yes. Inside one of the rooms, a group of older women laughed loudly over a knitting circle, their joy spilling into the hallway like sunlight. I watched them for a moment. Women with stories, with losses, with battles of their own, and realized how long it had been since I let myself be seen among people who didn't want to rewrite me. Marcia came back with a clipboard and a schedule, and I signed up for 2 shifts. As I left, she called after me, "We're always glad to have someone like you, Helen." I smiled and stepped out into the crisp afternoon, letting the door swing shut behind me. Later that evening, as dusk painted the buildings in soft purple shadows, my phone rang again. This time, it was Nathan. I hesitated for a beat, then answered. "Hello?" I said, voice quieter than I intended. "Hi," he replied. "I hope it's not too late to call." "Not at all," I said, sitting down at my kitchen table. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just full of the unspoken. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "Last night was, well, a lot." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Yes, it was. Nathan told me he'd stayed in a small hotel near the airport, but had no plans to fly anywhere. He was taking time to think, not about Emily specifically, but about everything he had allowed himself to believe. "It's strange," he said, "how you can love someone and still not see them clearly." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "We all wear masks," I replied. "Sometimes we wear them so long we forget we're still pretending." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think I kept making excuses for her because I didn't want to admit I'd built my future on a fantasy." That hit closer to home than he probably realized. "I used to do the same thing with her childhood," I admitted. "I told myself she was just going through a phase, that she'd come back to me when she was older." Nathan sighed softly on the other end. "Maybe she still will. But if she does, it has to be her choice, not your rescue." His words settled into the silence between us, not heavy but rooted, something that might grow over time. I held the phone tighter, surprised by how much comfort his voice brought me, how unburdened I felt talking to someone who had once been nearly my son-in-law. "That's the hardest part," I said after a while, "knowing I can't fix it, even if I wanted to." Nathan didn't rush to fill the space like most people did. He let the silence breathe, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was gentler. "You don't owe her that anymore, Helen. You don't owe anyone your healing just because they helped break you." I hadn't realized how much I needed someone else to say it out loud. For years, I had operated from a place of debt, unspoken, inherited, constantly compounding. But something inside me shifted when he said that, like a door I'd been leaning against had finally opened. "Thank you," I whispered. "I mean it." We talked a little longer, about nothing heavy. His brother's dog, the terrible coffee at the hotel, my volunteer shift next week. It felt like a conversation between old friends who had known each other longer than they actually had. There was no awkwardness, no pressure, just a sense of quiet understanding that didn't demand more than it gave. Before we hung up, Nathan said, "I hope you know I meant everything I said last night." I did know, And if you ever want to meet for coffee, just to talk or not talk, I'd like that, he added. I'd like that too, I replied, smiling despite myself. After the call ended, I sat for a long time in the kitchen, watching the sky darken through the window, the stars blinking into view like old memories finally surfacing. For once, I didn't feel like someone who had been discarded. I felt like someone finally being seen. Over the next few days, I let the silence with Emily stretch. She didn't call again, and I didn't reach out. There were no more texts, no apologies, no accusations, only a blank space where her voice used to live. At first, it unsettled me, like checking a wound and finding it no longer bleeding but still expecting pain. But slowly, that quiet became a kind of freedom. I got up each morning with a little more ease, a little more presence in my own life. I returned to the community center and helped serve lunch to a dozen women who reminded me of versions of myself. We shared stories, not the polished kind, but the ones with grit and quiet heroism. I listened as one woman spoke about raising 4 sons after losing her husband in a warehouse fire. Another had just learned to read at 63 and cried when she finished her first chapter book. And in all of them, I saw resilience that mirrored my own. I began keeping a journal again, something I hadn't done in over 20 years. It wasn't anything poetic or profound, just scraps of truth, moments I didn't want to lose. I wrote about Nathan's honesty, about the color of the sky on the morning after the wedding, about the way chamomile always reminded me of lullabies. One afternoon, I wrote a letter I didn't plan to send. It started with Dear Emily, and ended with, I hope you learn to love without shame someday. Writing it didn't make me cry. It made me exhale. I folded it up, slid it into a drawer, and went outside to sit on the porch, letting the breeze carry away the parts of me that were finally done waiting. Some grief doesn't disappear. It just loses its grip. A week after the wedding, I got a call from a woman named Kendra, who introduced herself as Nathan's cousin. He told me a little about you, she said, and I've seen the video. It's been shared more than you'd believe. My stomach clenched at the thought of strangers watching one of the most painful nights of my life. But Kendra's voice was warm, not invasive. I run a support group for mothers estranged from their adult children, she said. Would you consider speaking at our next session? I blinked, stunned. I'm not a therapist, I replied. You don't need to be, she said gently. You just need to be honest. Sometimes that's the bravest thing anyone can do. I agreed, reluctantly at first, then with growing conviction. It wasn't about revenge or attention. It was about truth, and the healing that comes from no longer hiding. That Thursday, I stood in a circle of folding chairs in a church basement, looking out at a dozen women with weathered eyes and hearts too big for their bodies. I told my story without embellishment. I talked about single motherhood, about giving and giving until I forgot how to receive. I talked about watching my daughter marry an idea of herself that didn't include me. And I talked about the moment someone who should have been a stranger, stood up for me when she wouldn't. When I finished, there was silence. Then one woman reached across the circle and took my hand. You said the thing I never knew I needed to hear, she whispered. And in that moment, I knew something had changed. Not everything got easier after that, but something inside me became sturdier. I no longer flinched when people asked about my family. I no longer felt the need to explain away her absence or smooth over the tension like it hadn't left cracks. When I saw photos of her online, smiling with coworkers, attending events alone, I didn't feel pain. I felt distance. I felt freedom. Nathan and I did meet for coffee. Eventually, we sat in a small shop on Main Street, laughing over a shared love of terrible puns and cinnamon scones. He told me he'd started therapy. Turns out, he said, there's a lot more to unlearn than I thought. I told him I understood, because I did. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. The coffee shop became a quiet ritual between Nathan and me, once a week, same table near the window, no pressure to be anything other than present. Sometimes we talked about the past, sometimes about nothing at all, and occasionally we sat in comfortable silence, sipping drinks while the world moved around us. People began to notice, of course, small-town curiosity working faster than gossip columns ever could. A few neighbors asked if we were dating, their eyes glinting with intrigue, but we always smiled and said, No, just friends. And that was true. For now. There was something deepening between us. But it wasn't rushed, wasn't labeled, wasn't forced to grow before it was ready. It was careful and gentle, like a wound being tended to, not pressed. He was healing from betrayal, and I was healing from a life of erasure, and somehow our broken edges aligned without cutting each other. When he laughed, it was lighter than the first time I met him. When I spoke, I didn't second-guess myself. There was safety in that table, in those moments, in the kind of company that didn't ask you to shrink. 3 months passed before I heard from Emily again. It came in the form of a handwritten letter, postmarked with no return address, as if she still wasn't sure whether she wanted me to write back. The handwriting hadn't changed. It was still tight, neat, controlled. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it, unsure what version of her I'd find inside. The letter was short, barely a page, and filled with starts and stops, like she was trying to speak a language she hadn't used in years. I don't know what to say that you'll believe. I don't even know if I'm writing this for you or for me, but I've started seeing a therapist. She told me I need to start owning things, so I'm starting here. I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope and placed it on my kitchen counter. I didn't cry. I didn't reply. I carried that letter with me for a week, tucked into my purse beside grocery lists and coupons I'd never use. I wasn't angry, not anymore, but I also wasn't ready to reopen a door just because someone knocked. Healing had taught me boundaries, and boundaries had taught me peace. At the community center, I shared her letter during a session, not the words, just the feeling it brought me. It's okay to be proud of someone and still not let them back into your life, I said. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. One of the women, Denise, nodded so hard her earrings shook. Amen to that, she whispered. I wasn't asking for validation, but I appreciated the solidarity. Sometimes, it's easier to accept your story when it echoes in someone else's. Nathan hadn't asked about Emily in weeks, and I hadn't offered updates. We respected the silence around her, understanding that some ghosts return when they're ready, or not at all. But one morning he walked in holding a newspaper, the front page featuring a column titled, "The Wedding That Wasn't." I felt my stomach turn, unsure if I was ready to relive that night through someone else's lens. You made the news, he said softly, sliding the paper toward me. I scanned the article, surprised to find it wasn't cruel. It was thoughtful, almost poetic. The journalist hadn't named us, but the details were unmistakable. A groom who called off the wedding mid-toast, a mother who had been cast aside, a daughter whose silence had become louder than words. The tone wasn't scandal. It was reverence. They got it right, I said, voice catching a little. They really did. After the article, the community center saw a small wave of new women who had read the story, recognized themselves, and walked through our doors with hope in their eyes. One brought her adult son with her, a quiet man who sat in the back and cried without making a sound. Another came in clutching a photo of her daughter, whispering, I just needed to be in a place where someone understood. I started teaching a weekly workshop called Letters to the Ones Who Left. We didn't mail them. We didn't even share them unless we wanted to, but we wrote. And in that writing, something shifted. Not erased, not fixed, but softened. Grief isn't just for the dead, I said during one session. Sometimes it's for the living who don't know how to love us. I had begun to learn the difference between closure and healing. Closure was a door slamming shut, abrupt and final. Healing was the slow process of building a new home inside yourself, one that didn't require anyone else's permission. My home was growing, filled with laughter from the center, quiet mornings on the porch, and the steady presence of Nathan, who had started walking me home after our coffee. He never pushed for more, but sometimes his hand would brush mine, and I didn't pull away. I didn't want to name it yet, this thing we were building. It was enough to know it existed, that we had found something meaningful in the wreckage, that love, the real kind, didn't need ceremony to be sacred. It was late spring when Emily showed up unannounced. I was outside, planting new bulbs in the garden bed beside the building. Lavender, marigold, and one small pot of forget-me-nots. She walked up slowly, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, her hair in a messy braid, no makeup, no armor. I saw her from the corner of my eye before I heard her speak. "Those were always your favorite," she said, nodding to the marigolds. I didn't stand. I simply looked at her and said, "You remembered." She nodded, stuffing her hands into her jacket pockets. "I never forgot," she said quietly. "I just didn't know how to come back." My hands were covered in soil, and I wiped them on a towel, waiting. "Then I guess we start from here," I said. Emily didn't step closer right away, as if the soil between us was sacred, like she knew better than to tread where new things were trying to grow. "I'm not here to make excuses," she said, voice rough from nerves or regret. I couldn't tell which. I nodded once, not to accept anything, but to let her speak. "I've been going to therapy," she continued, eyes fixed on the marigolds. At first, it was just so I could say I tried. But then I stopped lying to her, and to myself. I stood slowly, wiping my palms clean and meeting her gaze. Her face was thinner than I remembered, softer somehow without the heavy mask of pride. "I used to think your love was a trap," she admitted. "Like if I let it in, I'd owe you something forever." I didn't speak, didn't interrupt, didn't rush to comfort her. She wasn't finished. "I didn't know how to carry the weight of everything you gave me," she said, shifting her feet. "So I told myself it was easier to push you away than to be reminded every day that I didn't earn it." Her words were clumsy, but raw, and for once, they felt honest. But the truth is, I didn't know how to receive love that didn't come with conditions. So I made them up. I painted you into something hard and cold, because then I didn't have to face how small I felt. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked away quickly, blinking hard. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. Not today. I just needed to come here and tell you that I see it now. I see you." It took everything in me not to cry. Not because I was hurt, but because I had waited so long to hear something close to the truth. I looked at the flowers, the fresh soil, the kneeling cushion still warm from where I'd been sitting. "It wasn't about earning anything," I said, my voice steady. "You were my daughter. That was enough." Emily sniffed but didn't cry. She took a tentative step forward, still keeping distance, still unsure. I think I confused love with control because I didn't understand love without expectations. I nodded slowly, knowing better than to challenge the thought. "We can't change the beginning of our story," I said, "but we can decide how we want to write the next chapter." She looked down at her hands, picking at her sleeves. "I don't know how to do that," she whispered. "Neither do I," I replied. "But we can learn." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves and making the forget-me-nots flutter like they were nodding in agreement. Emily let out a long, trembling breath. "I kept the dishes," she said suddenly. "The china set you gave me at the wedding." That startled me more than anything else she'd said. "I thought you would have thrown it away," I admitted. "I almost did," she replied, voice thick. "But I couldn't. It was the only thing in that apartment that felt real. We didn't hug, not that day. There was too much unsaid, too much space that still needed to exist for us to rebuild without collapsing. But we agreed to meet the following week. Coffee, not in my home, not in hers, just neutral ground where old patterns couldn't creep back in. It was a small step, but it felt honest. When she walked away, she glanced back once, her shoulders a little less tight, her pace a little less rigid. I watched her go, heart torn open in a new, quiet way. Not bleeding, but growing. That night, I called Nathan and told him everything. "How do you feel?" he asked, always asking the right question. "Like spring," I said. "Messy, unpredictable, but full of beginnings." The next week, when I walked into the cafe, Emily was already there. She had chosen a corner table with sunlight spilling across it, and she stood when she saw me, unsure whether to sit again or wait. "Hi," she said, the word heavier than it should have been. "Hi," I answered. We didn't talk about the wedding. We didn't talk about Nathan. Instead, we talked about mundane things. Her new job, my workshops, the cafe, lopsided artwork. It was awkward at first, two people trying to remember how to speak without flinching. But by the time the drinks were cold, we were laughing at a memory from her childhood, one that hadn't been touched by resentment. I left with a small smile that lingered for hours. She texted later that night, "Thank you for today." I didn't reply immediately. I let the words sit. Nathan and I still met for coffee every Saturday. Sometimes we spoke of Emily, sometimes we didn't. One afternoon, after a long silence, he said, "Do you ever think about what could have been?" I knew what he meant. About him and me, about the paths that didn't quite cross the way they were meant to. "I do," I admitted, "but I also think about what is." He smiled, warm and steady, and reached across the table to briefly touch my hand. "This is good too," he said. "Yes," I replied. "It really is." By summer, the community center launched a new initiative for estranged mothers and daughters. Story circles. No judgment, no therapist, just space. We sat in mismatched chairs, held mugs of tea, and shared pieces of ourselves like puzzle fragments waiting for someone to understand the picture. I spoke less now, listened more. Healing had made me quieter, not weaker. It had taught me to let go of control and trust the soil to do what it's always done, grow what's been buried. And when Emily came one evening, not as my daughter, but as a woman needing a place to tell her truth, I didn't introduce her, she introduced herself. "My name's Emily," she said, voice trembling but steady, "and I'm learning how to stop running." The first time I heard Emily say those words, "I'm learning how to stop running," I felt something in me loosen. It wasn't instant forgiveness or some cinematic release of emotion, but a quiet shift, like an old window finally sliding open after years of being stuck. The women in the room didn't know she was my daughter, and neither of us told them. That anonymity gave us space to listen, without the weight of our history shadowing every word. She sat across the circle from me, her legs crossed, fingers tangled tightly in her lap, but her voice never shook. And when she shared a story about a birthday where she pushed away the one person who never forgot her, I didn't cry. I just nodded. She didn't need my tears. She needed my stillness. That night, after the session, she walked beside me in silence to the parking lot. "It felt good," she finally said, "to just be honest without explaining everything away." We started meeting once a week, sometimes at the center, sometimes at the cafe, and sometimes in the park where I used to push her on the swings. Our conversations were cautious but real, like learning to walk across a bridge that hadn't been tested in years. She asked questions now, the kind I'd waited her whole life to hear. "What were your dreams before I was born? Did it hurt when Dad left? What made you stay all those years when I shut you out?" I didn't rush to answer, didn't offer more than she could hold. I gave her the truth in careful doses, not to protect her, but to protect the fragile new space between us. She listened like someone trying to make sense of a story she'd misread for too long. And in those moments, I saw a version of her that reminded me of the child she used to be, curious, brave, unfinished. One day, she showed up with a worn photo album I hadn't seen in years. "I found this in a box I never unpacked," she said. "I think I'm ready to know the woman in these pictures." We sat on my couch, tea steaming in mismatched mugs, the album spread between us like a shared altar. She pointed to a picture of me in my 20s, holding her on my hip in front of a tiny apartment with peeling paint. "You look so strong," she said. "I was terrified," I answered with a small laugh, "but you never showed it." "Because I didn't want you to carry what wasn't yours." She flipped the page and stopped at a photo of her 6th birthday, balloons tied to the fence, cake crooked but smiling. "I don't remember this day," she whispered. "I do," I said. "You cried because you didn't get the purple dress you wanted, and I gave you mine to twirl in." Emily looked at me with new eyes then, not through the lens of guilt or blame, but recognition. We kept rebuilding, not from scratch, but from foundation stones that had always been buried deep. There were still hard days, still silences that lasted longer than they should, still memories she struggled to face. But she didn't run. She stayed. She showed up. She asked if she could help with the Story Circle project at the center, not as a guest, but as a volunteer. I watched her hold space for other women, listened to her speak without defensiveness, and knew she was finally becoming the kind of adult I had hoped she'd grow into. One who could love without fear, who could admit when she was wrong, who could sit in discomfort without reaching for someone else to blame. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that made it sacred. Nathan stayed in my life not as it could have been, but as a constant. We never labeled what we were because there was nothing fragile to define. Our bond had formed in fire and cooled into something resilient. When he asked one evening if I wanted to take a trip, just the two of us, I said yes without hesitation. We drove up the coast, stopped in small towns, shared motel breakfasts and oceanside silences. We didn't talk about Emily much, though she called once, asking if we'd bring back sea salt taffy. "She's healing too," Nathan said as we walked along the shoreline. "Yes," I replied, "but this time, so am I." We returned with sunburned noses and hearts that didn't feel so heavy anymore. On the 1-year anniversary of the wedding that wasn't, I expected sadness, maybe even regret. But instead, I woke up to a soft knock on my door. Emily stood there, holding a single marigold wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "I thought we could plant this one together," she said. I blinked back unexpected tears and nodded, guiding her to the garden bed beside the porch. We knelt in silence, hands in the dirt, planting something that would bloom in the months to come. As we watered it, she looked at me and said, "That night broke everything, but maybe it was supposed to." I didn't disagree. Sometimes collapse is just a louder kind of clarity. That evening, we gathered at the center for a community potluck. Women from all the programs, their families, new volunteers, and even a few curious men who had once dropped off their mothers and stayed. Emily brought her famous spinach quiche, and Nathan handled the sound system, playing a playlist filled with songs from every decade. I watched it all unfold from the side of the room, heart full, hands folded. The way you stand when you know you've done something right, even if it hurt. During dessert, the women surprised me with a plaque. It read, "To Helen, for choosing truth when silence would have been easier, for teaching us that love has boundaries." And that healing begins the moment we stop apologizing for surviving. I didn't have words, only tears, and a hand in mine, Emily's, holding tight and not letting go. Later that night, as the lights dimmed and guests trickled out, I sat alone in the garden, watching the marigolds sway under the moon. Nathan came to sit beside me, quiet as always, his presence more comfort than conversation. "Do you ever think about how different things would have been if you hadn't shown up that night?" he asked. I smiled gently. "I think about how different things would have been if I'd left when she told me to." He chuckled, then grew thoughtful. "You changed everything by staying." "Maybe," I said, looking up at the stars. "Or maybe I just finally stopped disappearing." The marigolds rustled gently, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a mother left behind. I felt like a woman finally coming home to herself. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you leave, there's another story similar to the one you just watched. You'll see it on the top left of your screen.